Given all that has happened so far in 2020, I thought it might be a good opportunity for us to take some time out tonight to summarize and reflect on some of the major events that have happened within the first 8 months of the year. And Bible prophecy is one of those topics that personally gives me confidence in the existence of God and that He's active in world affairs today, and also helps motivate me when I'm feeling maybe a bit flat or need to kick up the pants to get my spiritual life back on track. And if you're anything like me, then your spiritual life flows with peaks and valleys, and I find that current events in light of Bible prophecy helps me to get out of those valleys and focus on the reality that God and His angels are active today, and Christ will soon return to the earth. So hopefully our evening will in some way be beneficial to each one of us as we discuss some of the events so far this year that are highlighted in Bible prophecy. Now, undoubtedly, with the onset of coronavirus or COVID-19 and the consequences that have resulted in this pandemic, 2020 marks perhaps the most significant year in our lives, at least in terms of global impact. And I've heard it discussed throughout the media that this virus has brought forward or sped up events that were going to happen eventually, but they're now just being brought forward at a much faster rate. And examples include things like having virtual meetings, the rise of telemedicine, and many jobs are now being able to be done remotely. And well, when it comes to Bible prophecy, COVID-19 seems to have had the exact same effect. We know from Bible prophecy, specifically from our reading tonight of Ezekiel chapter 38, that there will be an alignment of nations before the great battle of Armageddon. And we have witnessed really throughout the past decades a progression towards these coalitions. But what this pandemic has appeared to do is fast forward these unions, largely based on the economic fallout from the countries being in lockdown. So if Christ continues to remain away, most people will recall one major topic when looking back at this year. And that topic is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Here in Australia, while we have been very blessed in terms of the numbers of infections and deaths, we remain in the midst of the pandemic and face restrictions on movement and the number of people that we can associate with. And while the long-term global effects remain largely unknown, we have witnessed many short-term side effects that gives us confidence that God, through His angels, are behind this pandemic, and we can see how it is being used to bring nations either together or apart, as outlined in prophecies such as Ezekiel 38. And it's amazing, isn't it, brothers and sisters, how God can bring about His purpose. How in His infinite wisdom, God can bring about a situation, such as this virus, with the consequences of that event bringing about His purpose. In this case, nations coming together for the battle of Armageddon and the return of His Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I probably wouldn't have guessed a pandemic would be used to bring about God's plan. But perhaps I should have. So we have in Luke 21, where we read these words of Jesus, which have a dual application to the event of AD 70 and also His impending return to the earth. We read in verses 10 and 11 of Luke 21, nations shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines, and pestilence, and fearful sights, and great signs there shall be from heaven. Now, the word pestilence here, according to the Strong's Concordance, comes from the Greek word loimos, which means a plague or disease. And we had it in our reading tonight of Ezekiel chapter 38 as well, towards the end of the chapter. And there's little doubt in my mind that God, through His angels, are using the circumstances behind this virus to bring forward the events surrounding Armageddon. Now, the initial plan for tonight was to go through each of the nations listed in Ezekiel 38 within the context of the coronavirus and demonstrate how recent events fit into the narrative of Bible prophecy. However, I soon realized that all that has been happening over the past 8 months, I would likely need many more nights to do it justice. So the approach that we're going to take tonight instead is to just focus on 3 of the major nations. Those are Russia, Britain, and Israel. Now, in your own time, you can go through other places in Scripture which share this thread of end times Bible prophecy. We have it in Daniel chapter 11, Joel chapter 3, Zechariah 12 and 14, and also in Revelation chapter 16. And running through all of these verses outlined on the slide is that thread concerning the end of the kingdoms of men, culminating in the battle of Armageddon. Now, given time restraints and our objective tonight, we won't spend time improving the modern day names for the ancient nations listed in Ezekiel 38. Again, that would be a separate class in itself, perhaps. And our slide here outlines what I believe the majority of Christadelphians would agree on. We have Rosh as Russia, Meshech and Tubal as other areas in Russia, Magog as Central and Eastern Europe, and Gomer as Western Europe. This includes France and Italy. And these make up a coalition that is joined by Persia, which is the ancient name for present-day Iran, along with Libya and Ethiopia, with Ethiopia having historically included the area we now refer to as Sudan. So those nations, along with many other people, as Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 6 puts it, make up one coalition. On the other side, we have an alliance that is headed by Tarshish, who we believe refers to modern-day Britain. And joining Tarshish are Sheba and Dedan, this includes the area of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Oman, and other Gulf states. And the alliance is joined by what is referred to in verse 13 of our chapter as the young lions. And we believe these young lions refer to the countries that came out from Britain. And this includes countries such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, and South Africa. And although there is some disagreement among those in our community, perhaps the United States as well. And so the chapter opens with a new prophecy, and we read that in the first few verses together. And we get the first set of place names here. So I'll just pick up the reading in verse 2. We read, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. The Revised Version of the Bible actually has a better rendering of verse 2 and reads, Son of man, set thy face toward Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So the expression, the chief prince, should read the prince of Rosh. And Rosh is a proper Hebrew name here and refers to an ancient name for Russia. And it is this nation that is the undoubted leader of the coalition and the antagonist throughout the remainder of the chapter. And they come to take a spoil from Israel. In other biblical prophecies, they are referred to as the king of the north. And Gog is a leader of Russia, and in the current context, that would be the position held by Vladimir Putin. And given that Russia is clearly the leader of the alliance, we should expect to see Russian influence spreading throughout the other nations listed, rising to prominence in both Europe and places like Sudan, Libya, and Iran. So let's then take some time to go through the recent news and current events surrounding the nation of Russia and its leader, Vladimir Putin. What has been of interest in Russia since the onset of COVID-19? Well, as usual, Russia, under the leadership of their president, have been very busy. And the pandemic provided an opportunity for Russia to fill a void left by NATO and the European Union. We saw this in March when Russia sent military plane loads of aid to Italy to combat the spread of coronavirus there, which has highlighted both the failure of NATO and the EU to provide swift help to a member crisis. And this handed Putin good publicity at home and abroad. And the mission was labeled From Russia with Love and consisted of planes and trucks with giant stickers showing heart-shaped Russian and Italian flags next to one another, as you can see in the slide there. Russia flew at least 15 flights to Italy using military transport planes with truck-based disinfection units. In addition, Putin sent 8 medical brigades, and another 100 personnel, including some of its most advanced nuclear, biological, and chemical protection troops. One of the senior NATO diplomats stated, "This is a big success for Putin." He said, "I think the Italians have fallen into a trap." And a senior fellow at the Moscow Carnegie Center noted that China and Cuba were also sending medical aid to Italy. And he's been quoted as saying, "For countries that would like to see the existing world order revised in their favor, the pandemic is an opportunity." And we know that Russia is currently subject to EU sanctions on its banking, financial, and energy sectors. And all 27 countries must renew them every 6 months. They all have to be in agreement. And this demonstration of assistance could have a dual application. Russia, again, highlighting the inadequacy of NATO, while also hoping to have sanctions lifted for the crime of the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. There's also been a push for closer ties with Russia within the European community. We read here, "Europe can only be stronger if it forges closer ties with Russia." That was a statement by Moldova's president. Igor Dodon called for more economic cooperation between Moscow and Brussels, and they've been embroiled in sanctions and since Russia's annexation of Crimea, as we said, in Ukraine. And he stated that the European Union needed fresh ideas and that his proposition would unite members of the bloc. He says, "I think Russia could help the EU be stronger, Europe to be stronger. Let's be honest, a strong Europe without the Russian Federation cannot be." And the coronavirus has also had a devastating impact on the price of oil, specifically at the height of the pandemic, when most countries went into lockdown and economies lay dormant. And you can see in this slide that the price absolutely bottomed out in late April. And Russia is the world's second largest producer of natural gas, so the Russian economy had also taken a hit at this time. However, you'll notice a bounce back in recent months as countries begin to open up and restart their economies. Prices are now again over $40 a barrel, getting back to the rates seen in 2017. While this next article was written in a pre-COVID world, the fact remains that the EU is extremely dependent on Russian energy. In 5 years, the Russian export of natural gas to Western Europe has increased 40%. The new gas pipeline project Nord Stream 2 will lead to this figure increasing over the next years. But critics, this is the important part, fear that Moscow will now have too much influence over European energy policies. And the background for the construction of the new pipeline is simple. There's a need to import Russian gas as that increases while European countries at the same time are producing less gas. And the pipeline is due to open at the end of this year, so it'll be interesting to see how dependent Europe will become on Russian energy. Of course, the EU are fully aware that Russia has historically used gas as a political tool with countries such as Ukraine and Belarus. The fact is that they may be beholden to Russian demands whether they like it or not. And it seems to be another case of European leaders playing checkers while Putin plays chess. Now, the next few slides that we have are some graphs and tables taken from data in 2018 to demonstrate the EU reliance on Russian energy. From this first slide, we can see here, in terms of the supply of crude oil, Russia makes up just under 30% of the total imports, with no other single country even in double digits. The percentage here is even higher when we come to natural gas, with Russian imports making up just over 40% for the total EU imports. And it's a similar story when we come to importing of solid fuel, with Russia making up an even higher percentage. It's now a touch over 42%. And our next slide here, we can see just how dependent the EU 27 are on outside sources of energy. This is the 27 countries that are now make up the EU. Really, the only self-sufficient one in the group is Estonia, and that's just in recent time. And this is where Russia comes into play, because as we witnessed in the previous slides, they are far and away the biggest single contributor to the supply of energy to the EU. And our last slide here highlights their importance to the big three countries in the EU: Germany, Italy, and France. And this is just from Russian gas, these figures here. So it's of no surprise that Russia should have some power over them as we look to their dependence on Russian energy. In Germany's case specifically, we can see that they're dependent 40% just on Russia alone for their needs. And over the past 8 months or so, we've also witnessed Russia again flexing its military might as a nation. And we saw this back in June when we had the Victory Day parade. Putin normally brings out new weapons, and again, this year was no different. And as the leader of the coalition described in Ezekiel 38, we would expect Russia to possess significant military clout, and that has proven to be true over the past decade. At the Victory Day parade, a battle tank designed for Arctic warfare and an anti-missile system were among the new Russian weapons on display. That was held on the 24th of June this year. This new tank was deployed to the Arctic military units in December. It's got a gas turbine engine, which means it's able to operate at temperatures that go as low as minus 40 degrees Celsius. And scores of these tanks are now believed to be deployed near the Norwegian and the Finnish borders. In addition to these new weapons, late last year, Russia's defense minister declared a new hypersonic weapon now ready for war, which is said to be capable of striking the United States. And the defense minister said in a conference call with Russian military leaders that the first missile equipped with the Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle is now available for combat duty. And this can travel at least 5 times, apparently, the speed of sound, or about 1 mile per second. And it was one of 6 new weapons that the Russian president unveiled in March 2018. At the time, the Russian leader claimed that the hypersonic weapon was capable of reaching targets at 20 times the speed of sound, and that it could strike like a fireball. And as it stands, the US and nor any other country has any defense against these type of weapons. Another example of showcasing their military prowess was seen just last week when the Russian Navy held its biggest war games since the days of the Soviet Union off the coast of Alaska, with more than 50 ships and 40 aircraft taking part in exercises. These were in international waters in the Bering Sea. And a couple of quotes from each side on the situation. Firstly, from the NORAD commander, General Glenn D. Vanher. He says, and I quote, "Our northern approaches have had an increase in foreign military activity as our competitors continue to expand their military presence and probe our defenses. This year, we've conducted more than a dozen intercepts, the most in recent years, and the importance of our continued efforts to project air defense operations in and through the north has never been more apparent." And then we have Russia's Navy Chief, Admiral Nikolai Yevmenev, confirmed that the exercises involved multiple practice missile launches. And he stated that they are holding such massive drills there for the first time ever. Yevmenov said that in a statement released by the Russian Defense Ministry. And he said that the war games are part of Russia's efforts to boost its presence in the Arctic region and protect its resources. Quote, "We are building up our forces to ensure the economic development of the region." So we see that the Russian military is prioritizing this presence in the region, which is believed to hold up to 25% of the Earth's undiscovered oil and gas. You may recall earlier in our talk that part of the coalition that is built by Russia when they come up against Israel includes modern-day Sudan. Well, wouldn't you know it, but last month, the German daily newspaper Bild, citing a leaked source from the German Foreign Ministry, writing that the Russians are building military bases now in 6 African countries, including one in Sudan. The report said that by courting by courting some of the continent's most dictatorial regimes, the Kremlin was contractually assured it would be allowed to build military bases in 6 countries. And these 6 countries are Central African Republic, Egypt, Eritrea, Madagascar, Mozambique, and of course Sudan. And this was according to the Foreign Ministry's leaked document. And quoting the article from the Business Insider, Sudan particularly interests Putin and Russia as it sits on the strategic Red Sea waterway. And we know that throughout history that Sudan has a history of hostility towards the West. And in 1993, the United States designated Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism. So again, we can see a latter-day alliance taking shape. Now, speaking of latter-day alliances, we can see that Russia is exerting its will both over NATO and the EU. And our next article outlines how Russia has been reasserting itself both politically and militarily, with experts arguing that Moscow claims or aims to reclaim its old glory. Now, at the end of the Cold War, one of NATO's main military and political goals was to encircle Russia, a then weakening power after the dissolution of the former communist Soviet Union. That was in the late 1980s. And they wanted it to prevent it from expanding its influence outside its own borders. Well, fast forward about 3 decades later, and the reverse is happening. Under President Vladimir Putin's leadership, Moscow is pulling strings in different directions, from Ukraine to Syria, and most recently, Libya. Again, remember, Libya is part of that latter-day coalition, and they're gaining the upper hand over NATO forces and the EU. Now, like its Ukraine operation, Moscow marches on another European state, Belarus, which happens to be closer to the areas designated as part of NATO's eastern flank. About 20 years ago, the 2 states, this is Belarus and Russia, signed a union agreement, which has been understood differently by each country. According to the Russian understanding, Belarus should be part of the Russian Federation soon in the implementation of the agreement. And we've got a quote here from TRT World back in, this was end of December last year. And quote, European allies have been worried that after what has happened in Ukraine, with Belarus, Russia could also take hold in a strategic location to geographically divide NATO's Baltic allies, which used to be part of the former Soviets, being located between Moscow-held Kaliningrad and Belarus. It could even make the defenses of the Baltic states more vulnerable to a possible Russian attack. Remember, it was just back in 2014 when Russia illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, which could do nothing to stop the invasion, as the opposition from Europe and its allies remained confined to just protests. So remember, that was just the end of last year. Well, the EU's fears are being realized. Look at our next article here that we have, which was taken more recently. This is from all the news coming out of the civil unrest in Belarus. And you may be aware that the Belarusians held their presidential elections in early August, with the incumbent, who's a man by the name of Alexander Lukashenko, who has won every election since 1994. He was re-elected again. And he's been nicknamed Europe's last dictator, since all but the first of his presidential elections were labeled by international monitors as neither free or fair. And his recent re-election has caused protests from Belarusian citizens in many countries and organizations, including the EU, the United Kingdom, and Canada, and they've all refused to accept the result of the election. But the issue that specifically the EU has is that Lukashenko is backed by Vladimir Putin. And look at these recent comments from the Belarusian president from the 15th of August, so just last month. He says that his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, has agreed to help to ensure the security of the country if needed, as thousands of people continue to hold protests against his rule. Facing the biggest challenge to his rule since taking power in 1994, Lukashenko called in Moscow's help after warning there was a threat not only to Belarus. And then he goes on to say, to talk about the military element, this is Lushenkov, saying, to talk about the military element, we have an agreement with Russia as part of the Union State and Collective Security Treaty Organization. Such situations fall under that agreement. Lukashenko told defense chiefs, according to the Belta state news agency. And again, he says, I had a long, substantial conversation today with the Russian president. We agreed that at our very first request, comprehensive help would be given to ensure the security of Belarus. So, brethren and sisters, the EU governments are put in an awkward position of trying to strike a balance with Belarus, a country that shares a border, as you can see here, with 3 EU countries, as well as with Russia. And mindful of Belarus's close ties with Moscow, they are anxious to avoid any action that could give Putin a reason to intervene militarily. Officials also caution that the crisis remains extremely fluid. Much will depend on how the protests evolve and how Lukashenko's administration reacts to those protests. And EU officials are aware that their influence is quite limited, while other outside powers, principally Vladimir Putin, can have a big say in the outcome. And it's interesting that the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the French President Emmanuel Macron, and the European Council President Charles Michel all spoke separately by phone with Putin about the crisis. And just look at some of the excerpts from this Politico article based from the 19th of August. Quote, the European Union's policy on Belarus crisis comes down to 4 words: speak clearly, tread carefully. And also, if Russia were to intervene, it would present a major test for the EU, with at least some member countries sure to be reluctant to impose further sanctions on Moscow. It would be hardly possible to agree on full sanctions, for example, stopping buying Russian gas, argued a diplomat. Again, we can see why when we look back at the supply of Russian energy, and specifically gas, to the EU. Now, while we've witnessed Russia as a country display their power this year, the same can be said of their leader, Vladimir Putin. And the Russian-Belarus storyline doesn't end there. And history tells us it doesn't pay to be a dissident in Russia, particularly under Vladimir Putin. The latest victim of a suspected poison attack back on the 20th of August was politician and anti-corruption campaigner Alexei Navalny. He has been in a medically induced coma and is now in Germany after being poisoned while taking a flight to Moscow. And he's a fierce critic of Vladimir Putin and has been described as an extreme nationalist and the most dangerous man in Russia by some of his former colleagues. And the Wall Street Journal has described him as, and I quote, the man Vladimir Putin fears the most. And one suspects that Putin is in agreement with such a characterization, given the fact that Navalny has been jailed 13 times, he's been barred from appearing on state media, and was previously attacked in March 2017, when then he was doused with a chemical dye outside his office, resulting in the loss of 85% of the sight in his right eye. And what is interesting is the apparent reason for this latest attack, this latest poisoning. According to John E. Herbst, who's the director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, the reason for this action taken against Navalny lies in the Russian city of Khabarovsk and the Belarus capital, Minsk. Now, Khabarovsk has witnessed large anti-Putin demonstrations for the jailing of its governor since July, and Navalny had actually gone there to talk and to campaign in support of the citizens. And as we saw in our previous story, massive demonstrations are also underway in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, since the re-election of Alexander Lukashenko, who's their president. Again, as we previously stated, Belarus is important to Putin as it acts as a buffer between NATO and Russia. And he doesn't want to let the country go towards the West, though the young people in Belarus seem inclined to go that way. But at the same time, he can't have dissidents come up in his own country as well. And here on the screen, we have a quote from John E. Herbst on the situation there. He says, the poisoning of opposition leader Alexei Navalny while he was in Siberia organizing for regional elections is an indication that the Kremlin is nervous about the demonstrations and their possible impact on the regional elections. But also it leaves on the sidelines a powerful critic who could offer the Russian people a skeptical narrative if the Kremlin decides to intervene in Belarus. Now, on the topic of personal power being exerted by Vladimir Putin, we need to look no further than the controversial Russian reform vote that took place from the 25th of June this year to the 1st of July. And nearly 78% of all Russian voters backed the reforms that could keep Vladimir Putin in power until 2036. And the reforms will reset the president's term limits to 0 in 2024, enabling him to serve 2 additional 6-year terms, again taking it to 2036. Not that he likely needed it, but COVID-19 provided good cover for any voting improprieties, as the vote was spread over 7 days because of the risk of the coronavirus, making monitoring of the vote more difficult. We've got a quote here from Golos, which is an independent Russian election monitoring group, and they were criticizing the vote, saying there was many violations of democracy, and its criticisms included opponents being barred from campaigning in the media, remote electronic voting was organized on a legal basis, and election monitors were appointed by the Civic Chamber, which is a government body. Now, while there's plenty more we could discuss with Russia, we'll now move on to cover our next nation in Britain. Now, perhaps the most prominent fulfillment of Bible prophecy in my lifetime has been the withdrawal of Great Britain from the European Union. Since Brother John Thomas wrote Elpis Israel in 1850, Christadelphian teaching has been that Britain had to be separate from Europe. And quoting from Elpis Israel, part 3 and page 293, Brother Thomas writes, "Britain cannot be included among them being the toes of Europe," with the word reference in Daniel chapter 2. Britain at that time, of course, was separate, but on the 1st of January 1973, they joined, as it was called then, the European Communities, which would later become the European Union. We've got some other quotes here as well from previous brethren. Our brother Graham Pierce would then write in the Milestones magazine in 1981, and I quote, "Though we don't know how it will happen, Britain will separate from Europe." 8 years later, he would also write in the Milestones in 1989, and I quote, "It should be obvious that Britain biblically has no place in Europe when Christ comes." And finally, our brother Paul Billington wrote in 1990, "The guardians of Israel and Arabia," and I quote there, "She, Britain, is therefore perforce not part of the European system when these prophecies are finally fulfilled. Britain's eventual exit from Europe is a certainty." An exit they did, though it's been a bit of a long, drawn-out process that began way back now in June 2016, when the UK voted in a referendum to leave the European Union. It would then almost take 2.5 years before EU leaders and the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, would agree on a withdrawal deal, but it was one that still tied the UK with Europe. Unsurprisingly, the UK rejected the deal 3 times from January to March 2019, and this led to Theresa May stepping down as Prime Minister. And we know, don't we, that Boris Johnson took over the leadership, and he created a lot of enthusiasm to leave the EU in the process. And he agreed to a new deal with the EU in October, and a month later, after his Conservative Party won their largest majority since Margaret Thatcher won a 3rd term in 1987, British MPs backed Boris Johnson's bill. And that led us into this year, where Britain officially left the EU, at least politically, on the 31st of January. And they are currently in a transition period where trade talks were to commence to try and work out a new deal going forward between the two. Of course, then COVID-19 hit and conveniently put these trade talks on the back burner while countries have been busy dealing with the fallout in the domestic health and economic concerns that come with dealing with the pandemic. And we know that Boris Johnson himself came down with the coronavirus, testing positive on the 27th of March this year. And it ended up being so severe he was moved into intensive care at the hospital. And he was eventually discharged on the 12th of April, but again, any thought of trade talks were well and truly set aside. You'll notice on the slide that on the 30th of June this year, there was a deadline to extend the transition period for the trade talks. And given the circumstances of the year, you might think that Britain would have extended the talks. However, on the 12th of June, the British Cabinet Minister, Michael Gove, formally confirmed that the UK would not seek an extension of the Brexit transition period beyond the end of this year, the 31st of December. Naturally, the EU were open to an extension, but took Britain's decision as a definitive one. Well, what happens now? As you can see from the slide, that Britain and the EU have until the 31st of December to ratify a new trade deal. So how likely is this to happen? Well, according to Bible prophecy, we just can't see a situation where Britain remains politically or economically linked to the EU. Just look at the description of Britain in our reading that we had tonight in Ezekiel chapter 38. We'll pick up the reading where it describes the forces who are in opposition to this Russian-led invasion of Israel. Verse 13, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, and to take a great spoil? Notice that it's the merchants of Britain here, under their historical name of Tarshish, along with these Commonwealth countries, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And they're questioning why Russia has come to Israel, and if it was to take a spoil. And Britain is described as a merchant or a trading power here. And that would be improbable if they're still held within the bounds of the EU and not allowed to make their own trade agreements. And every indication with the current negotiations also point towards a failure to reach a new trade deal. For one, the EU would like a deal in place before the 15th of October, a date when the European Council meets. The EU then state that they would need the remainder of the time, up until the 31st of December, to have that deal ratified. And given that we're now into September and not really any closer to a deal, time is quickly running out for that deadline. And there's also the current tone of negativity that comes from both sides. Obviously, in any negotiation, the parties will keep the cards close to their chests. But just look at some of the language that has come from the recent meetings. This one's from just Monday past. Britain's chief negotiator, David Frost, has signaled to his EU counterpart, Michel Barnier, that he will recommend Britain leaves without a trade deal if Brussels continues to demand that the UK should align with its rules on state aid. And Mr. Frost has already taken a hard stance on the topic in private meetings. Now, the issue regarding state aid is that the EU wants Britain to continue to follow the rules that prevent the government from subsidizing British companies over EU rivals. And in any other situation, that might be fine. But look at these next few lines. I find it incredible to see the hand of God at work once again through this virus. The Express article continues. A senior Conservative source said Mr. Frost and others had privately talked about whether to soften Britain's line on state aid, but Prime Minister Boris Johnson reportedly decided that the UK should not soften its position. The source told the Times, Frost has made it clear to Barnier that as things stand, he would have to recommend to Boris that we go for no deal. And there's been a discussion about whether or not to compromise on state aid, and Boris has said no. Mr. Johnson's senior aide, Dominic Cummings, thinks that freedom on state aid could be one of the Brexit's main benefits. He believes this because the coronavirus pandemic may lead to historic levels of state intervention in order to support key companies and industries. So how interesting is that? Amazing. But what about from the EU side? Well, here are some statements from the EU chief negotiator, Michel Barnier. Speaking at a press briefing, in Brussels, Mr. Barnier accused the UK side of wasting valuable time, suggesting that the draft text that they'd come up with was useful, but downplaying its significance in reaching any agreement. And quote, he says, too often this week it felt as if we were going backwards more than forwards. given the short time left, what I said in London in July remains true. Today, at this stage, an agreement between the UK and the EU seems unlikely. Now, given that failure does seem likely, Britain has been proactive in laying the groundwork for future trade deals with other countries. And given the context of our talk this evening, you probably won't be very surprised as we go through some of these potential trade deals. Now, it's important to note that these deals will not become official until the end of the transition period, but there has been encouraging signs of future trade agreements between Tarshish, or the Britain, and the Young Lions. And according to the BBC, the UK government is negotiating with 18 countries that have current EU trade deals, including Canada. And in addition, the UK government is also holding trade talks with the US, Australia, New Zealand, and India. And while we know Israel was the first country to actually finalize a post-Brexit trade deal with the UK. Now, it's just an in-principle deal that would be signed and come into effect on the 1st of January, 2021. And in the next few slides, we have some comments surrounding this agreement between Israel and the UK, along with some other positive words from other nations that make up this group of the Young Lions described in Ezekiel 38. Firstly, we have Israel's economy minister, Eli Cohen, in speaking in connection to the agreement that they hadn't really signed it. It's an in-principle agreement between Israel and the UK, expressed his hope that the trade agreement between them, the two countries, would, and I quote, accelerate, increase, and strengthen their economic relationship. The Australian Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, is quoted as saying, as both nations begin to shift our focus towards the economic recovery from COVID-19, a UK-Australia free trade agreement would help expand choices and export opportunities and secure longer supply chains to better withstand future shocks. And then the Commerce and Industry Minister of India is quoted as saying, New Delhi wants to discuss a preferential trade agreement with the UK with the ultimate goal of a free trade agreement. Continuing on, we have the New Zealand Trade Minister, David Parker, stating, as the UK embarks on its next steps post-Brexit, New Zealand is pleased to be among the first countries to negotiate a trade agreement with one of our oldest friends. New Zealand and Britain have a close relationship, including strong trade and economic ties, common values and traditions, and a shared history. You can see part of that history there with one of the on the slide. I believe it was the First World War, one of the posters that was sent out. You've got Britain there, the old lion, and surrounded by her young lions, and labeled there Australia, Canada, India, and New Zealand. So should Christ remain away for some time, it will be very interesting post-Brexit to watch these former ties grow stronger again, in line with Bible prophecy. And what will also be interesting to see develop will be how the EU copes without Britain. The withdrawal of Britain from the EU has left them with a €75 billion hole in the EU's budget for the next 7 years. So they're actually putting their budgets together for 2021 to 2027 in the middle of this pandemic. And one EU diplomat was quoted as saying the remaining countries are now fighting like ferrets in a sack. So going forward, in terms of Bible prophecy, we'd expect to see Europe with ever closer ties with Russia under the leadership from a re-emerging Catholic and Orthodox Church power, while the UK, on the other hand, takes a leadership role in re-establishing bonds with the Young Lion powers. Now, before we move on to our last nation for the night, I just had to bring you one last story that ties in so well concerning Britain, and again stems from the COVID pandemic. It would appear that Britain is once again going back to her roots as a maritime power, bringing back the ships of Tarshish as they're described throughout the Bible. And here we just have an excerpt from an article published just Saturday past. The title of the article is Britain's Shipbuilding Boom. Tens of thousands of jobs could turn coastal areas into powerhouses. This is taken from the Express. And quote, Britain's shipbuilding industry is on the threshold of a resurgence. that could create tens of thousands of jobs and transform economically stagnant communities into coastal powerhouses, Maritime UK said last night. Our forecast is that this will account for 15,200 new direct jobs and as many as 73,000 other jobs when considering the supply chain. The move will be the first stage of a broader industrial policy, which will see the UK resume the development of niche, luxury, and military vessels. It would then go on to stimulate a rejuvenation in the shipbuilding industry, because this is about creating propulsion systems which go on new vessels built in our shipyards. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said this exciting new chapter will create hundreds of new jobs in the southwest and beyond, and will drive forward our ambitions to become a shipbuilding superpower. And Johnson went as far as he could go to make a commitment that he'll be bringing more shipbuilding back to the UK. And that was clearly a nod to the Royal Navy. So in the middle of, we have this pandemic and lots of people are out of work and there's lots of lockdowns and the economies of really the globe are going into recession. I think Australia just went into recession, it was announced today. So in response to that, we have the UK going back to its roots in shipbuildings. Yeah, absolutely amazing. And how can we not think of scripture like Isaiah 60 and verse 9 when we read articles like this? There in Isaiah we read, "Surely the isles wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring thy sons from far, their silver and gold with them, unto the name of the Lord thy God, and to the Holy One of Israel, because he hath glorified thee." So if we were ever in any doubt that God is in control of all that is happening, brothers and sisters, it's events like this that should give us such confidence in our God and how soon his purpose will be brought about. Now, of course, that purpose is intertwined with our last example for the evening, the nation of Israel. And it's this country of Israel which forms the setting for our reading of Ezekiel chapter 38 and the ensuing battle of Armageddon. And we'll just pick up a couple of references to the nation of Israel in the chapter that we read together, beginning at verse 8. "After many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that's brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have all been always waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them." The prophecy then goes on to describe Russia and its confederacy coming to take a spoil and to attack God's people in Israel. And we pick up the reading then in verse 16 to 19. "And thou shalt come up against my people Israel, as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days, and I will bring thee against my land, that the heathen may know me, when I shall be sanctified in thee, O God, before their eyes. Thus saith the Lord God, Art thou he of whom I have spoken in old time by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them? It shall come to pass the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel." And notice that it's God who is bringing this battle together. In verse 16, God says it is he who is bringing Russia against Israel. There can be no doubt then that as we go through our last series of current events involving Israel, that God and his angels are in control of these as well. We'll begin with probably the most monumental of which occurred on the 13th of August with the peace treaty between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and the decision for the UAE to fully normalize relations with Israel. And it marked just the third Arab country to do so, and the first to do so in the last 25 years, following Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994. And it's also the first of the Arab Gulf states to have a peace treaty with Israel. And what's so significant for us as Bible students is that it again confirms Bible prophecy, and that we know that the Gulf states, including the UAE, will be in alliance with Israel before Armageddon occurs. And the UAE, along with other Gulf states, are that modern-day D-Dan of Ezekiel 38. Now, discreet contact has been made for many years between Israel and the UAE, but almost everyone was taken by surprise when the announcement was made. And it's now widely speculated that countries such as Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, and possibly even Morocco will follow suit and normalize relations with Israel if the announcement goes by without any major incident. And so far, so good. It also marks a change in how peace has been agreed upon. In the past, Israel has made peace in exchange for giving up land. But this is the first, basically, a peace in exchange for peace deal. And Israel has agreed to temporarily shelve plans for the annexation of parts of the West Bank. Well, that's more so for the UAE to save face than anything else. Again, it's a temporarily shelving of the plans. And as the BBC put it, this deal is, quote, in short, about two things: strategic advantage and technology. You see, the UAE, along with Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf states, have a deep fear of Iran, who, as we stated earlier, are listed as Persia in Ezekiel 38. And they will be, and indeed already are, a close ally with Russia. Iran used to be confined to its own region, but it now has proxies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And these are seen as a threat to the Gulf Arab rulers. And so they share a common enemy here with Israel. And then there's that matter of technology, and that's including biotechnology, healthcare, along with defense and cyber surveillance. And this is where Israel is so prominent, being by far the most technologically advanced country in the Middle East. And some of the Gulf states, including the UAE, have already purchased Israeli technology in these areas. And here we have listed just some of the reactions by the international community after hearing about this peace treaty between Israel and the UAE. From Egypt, we have from the Egyptian President Sisi, I quote, "I followed with interest and appreciation the joint statement between the United States, United Arab Emirates, and Israel to halt the Israeli annexation of Palestinian lands, taking steps to bring peace in the Middle East." From Bahrain, the Gulf state of Bahrain welcomed the accord between UAE and Israel. State news agency BNA said, "The small island state is a close ally of Saudi Arabia and praised the United States for its efforts towards securing a deal." And Oman said that it backed the normalization of ties between the neighboring United Arab Emirates and Israel, and had hoped the move would help achieve a lasting Middle East peace. Of course, not everyone was happy with the peace treaty. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said that the deal was a huge mistake. He went on to add that the Emirates rulers think that if they approach America and the Zionist regime, their security will improve and their economy will grow, but this is totally wrong. The Iranian leader said that the UAE-Israel deal was a betrayal of the Palestinian cause. And the Iranian Foreign Ministry denounced the deal as an act of strategic stupidity from Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv. So, to no one's surprise at all, really, they didn't think too highly of this treaty. Now, in other relevant news for Israel, the coronavirus has perhaps had an unforeseen impact in that Israel has seen a surge in Jews from around the world wanting to immigrate or make Aliyah back to Israel. Now, for those that turned into the Youth Aliyah evening a fortnight ago, there was a representative there from the Jewish Agency who gave quite a good talk and advised that Israel were estimating that about 250,000 Jews will try and make Aliyah over the next 5 years. That's double the normal rate. And she said that many of these are due to the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly those living in poorer countries that do not have the health infrastructure to cope with the global pandemic. And specifically, she spoke about places, I believe it was definitely in South America, I think it was Venezuela. And this is confirmed by the Times of Israel when they posted an article on the 18th of June titled "Coronavirus Homecoming." And it was all about Israel readying itself for the post-pandemic wave of immigration. And within the article, the immigration minister says that by the end of next year, 2021, Israel can expect the arrival of 90,000 immigrants, compared to 35,463 last year. And in France, the virus has claimed the lives of over 30,000 people now, with the Jewish community being particularly hit hard. And that representative from the talk that we had a fortnight ago mentioned this as well, and how it was a lot of the Jewish leaders that had been inflicted with coronavirus and had passed away. And how amazing is it that God is calling his people back to their homeland, just like it is prophesied in the Bible, like in verses such as our chapter tonight, Ezekiel 38 and verse 8, which says, Thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and has gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have always been wastes, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. And it's interesting that all Jews, as well as children and even grandchildren of Jews, are entitled under Israel's law of return to automatically receive citizenship if they immigrate to Israel. And another reason for the increase in Jewish people immigrating to Israel is the rise in anti-Semitism. Specifically, the speaker a fortnight ago touched on the fact that there was a big increase in France. And we touched on this a few weeks ago in our seminar on Israel. Beginning in 2014, we've seen an increase in immigration every year to Israel, mainly accredited to French Jews leaving France for Israel. And these numbers increased when, in the summer of 2014, pro-Palestinian demonstrations disintegrated into attacks on the Jewish community. Facing record levels of anti-Semitism, many French Jews are joining an exodus to Israel. And a third of all the French Jews who've immigrated to Israel since its establishment in 1948 have done so in just the last 10 years. And that's according to the data from the Jewish Agency. And they, as we found out a fortnight ago, facilitate Jewish immigration to Israel. In 2015 alone, there were nearly 8,000 French Jews who immigrated, the largest number from any Western nation in a single year. But anti-Semitism hasn't just seen an uptick in France. Europe as a whole has seen attacks against Jews increase over the last decade. And this again is in line with what we know will happen in the last days. Catholic Europe will join with Russia to attack the Jewish people in Israel. And in December 2018, a survey on experiences and perceptions of anti-Semitism in Europe, which is the European Union's fundamental rights agency, found that 89% of Jews living in countries such as Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, France, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, and Spain, and the UK felt that anti-Semitism had increased in their country over the past decade, while 85% believed it to be a very serious problem. Now, for our final news item tonight, we'll just again turn to the 8th verse in Ezekiel chapter 38, where we learn that the Russian invasion occurs in the mountains of Israel. And that's where the Jews will be living in safety. Now, 90% of the hills and mountains in the land of Israel are located in the West Bank. So this prophecy is telling us that the West Bank will no longer be Palestinian territory. There won't be a Palestinian state in the West Bank. And at the last election in Israel, which was their third in a very short time frame, both major parties shared a policy to annex at least portions of the West Bank. This plan, of course, had its detractors, especially in the Middle East, but one backer of the plan was the United States. And just look at this article from April this year, which is entitled, U.S. Says Ready to Recognize Israel's Annexation of West Bank Areas, taken from the 20th of April. And we read in the article, the agency cites the official as saying that the U.S. is prepared to give its nod to Israel's push to, quote, extend Israeli sovereignty and the application of Israeli law to areas of the West Bank, referring to the zones earmarked for becoming part of Israel under U.S. President Donald Trump's peace plan. Then recognition would be granted in the context of Israel holding talks with the Palestinians along the lines laid out in the Peace to Prosperity Plan. And these would include an offer to the Palestinians to achieve statehood with economic support from the outside and based on the conditions outlined in Donald Trump's deal of the century. Now, under the peace plan that the Trump administration laid out earlier in the year, there was a land swap between Israel and the Palestinians, with Jerusalem annexing areas in the West Bank in exchange for a swath of land being added to the Gaza Strip. Now, we can't be dogmatic and say that this deal will go through. We know there was a lot of negativity, especially from the Palestinian side. So we can't be dogmatic and say that it's definitely going to go through in the future, especially since the recent UAE-Israeli peace treaty, where Israel said they would temporarily halt annexation plans. But the emphasis again is on that word temporarily. And so Israel has given themselves the ability in the future to go back to that plan or some form of that plan. And having a Palestinian state in the area of the Gaza Strip, which was put in the last plan by Donald Trump, again, there was that trade-off of land given to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip in exchange for land in the West Bank for Israel. That would appear to fit in with Bible prophecy. In Joel chapter 3, which again is one of those chapters that speaks of the end times, just look at what we read in verse 4. I quote, "Yea, and what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Zidon, and all the coasts of Palestine? Will ye render to me a recompense? And if ye recompense me, swiftly and speedily will I return your recompense upon your own head." So notice the reference there to the coasts of Palestine. Now, there's no coastline, obviously, in the West Bank, but there is along the Gaza Strip. So it will be interesting to see any developments there if Christ remains away. Well, I think given the time, brothers and sisters, we might leave our class there for tonight. Obviously, there's been lots more happening throughout this year, from the animosity between China and the West, Turkey creating issues all over the Middle East, the explosion in Lebanon, civil unrest in the United States, etc. But I just thought before we close, I'd list a few items that might be worth keeping an eye on in the future, should our Lord tarry. And I'll just list it here on the slide, where it'll be interesting to see what Russia does in Belarus and what the Belarusian president asks for from Putin. We also have the United States presidential elections coming up on the 3rd of November. Up until recently, again, in the media has been saying that Joe Biden has a huge chance to win, but that's starting to be clawed back with all the civil unrest that's happening in the state. So it'll be very interesting to see who will be chosen as president then. Also, will the annexation of the West Bank be back on the cards in the near future? We wouldn't expect it to be anytime soon, given the deal, like we said, between the UAE and Israel, but who knows? And will other Gulf states follow the lead of the UAE and sign peace treaties with Israel? We might expect some of those other Gulf states too, in line with biblical prophecy and the fact that there hasn't really been any blowback on the UAE since that was signed. There's been a lot of rhetoric, which there always is, but there's been no major incident yet. And coming up next year, Angela Merkel is going to step down as the German chancellor, so it will be interesting to see who fills that role. And then, of course, what twists and turns are left with COVID-19, and will a vaccine be discovered? So we're very blessed to be living in the last days before the return of Christ, where we have access to all this information to see all these signs around us. Knowledge is one thing, but it's our response to these events that's so important. Now is the time to ourselves and our families to his truth. As we can see, our God is in control, and his son Jesus will return to judge us and the world soon, we know. We pray for that time when Israel will be exalted among the nations, with God's kingdom established in the city of Jerusalem. By God's grace, may we all be part of that kingdom soon to come.